You're watching the Nubia Redmagic 7 Pro Disassembly. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe and follow me on Twitter so you'll be notified when I upload a new video. And if you need any tools, there are links in the description. To start off, the sim tray needs to be removed. Next, we need to apply heat to the back plate using a hairdryer or a heat gun to loosen up the adhesive underneath, and then we're going to use a plastic pry tool to pry the back plate off. Here's a better look at the glass backplate. The aluminum air chamber and block is located here, and the entire center panel is made of aluminum. There's also thermal paste to help transfer heat from the components into the air chamber so the fan can vent it out. Here's a look at the inside of the air chamber or heat block with the heat plate removed, and there's a mesh filter over the opening of the air intake. There are 14 T4 or Torx 4 screws that need to be removed, as well as 3 Phillips screws. Now the top plastic cover can be removed. The LED flash is located here, and here's a look at the other side. The flex cable for the LED flash runs underneath, and these are the 2 contact points which make a connection with the board, giving it power. There are also some antenna lines drawn through this plastic piece, which are these light gray color lines. Next, this cover covering the cable connectors needs to be lifted up and removed. The right side is tucked into the frame, so we need to lift it up and pull it to the left a little bit to release it. There's a large area of copper film which helps transfer heat. And on the back side, there's some graphene film. At this point, the battery cables need to be disconnected. Once the battery cables are disconnected, we can proceed to disconnect the rest of the cables. There are 3 coaxial cables on the bottom right side of the board that need to be disconnected by popping them off. There's an additional T4 or Torx 4 screw on the bottom that needs to be removed. Now the bottom speaker assembly can be lifted up and removed. Here's a better look at the speaker assembly. The flex cable connecting the main board to the subboard can be disconnected and removed. The battery overlay or cover can be peeled off and removed. And taking a look at the battery itself, there are no pull tabs to help us pry the battery off. So we're going to have to use some isopropyl alcohol and apply it to the edges of the battery and let it sit there for about a minute so it eats away at the adhesive underneath, making it easier to pry it off. Here's a better look at the dual cell battery, with each cell consisting of 2500 mAh. The flex cable for the fingerprint reader, as well as the 2 other ends of the coaxial cable, need to be disconnected from the subboard. There is a single Phillips screw holding down the subboard that needs to be removed. Now we can remove the subboard. The primary microphone is located underneath the shield, and there's a liquid damage indicator sticker, which is a white sticker. The SIM reader is located on the back. At this point, the flex cable with the charger port can be lifted up and removed. There's a red rubber gasket around the charger port. And here's a look at the other side. There's an X-axis vibrator motor which is located on the bottom right corner, and that's held on with some adhesive. The fingerprint reader is glued to the screen, and the flex cable for this touch capacitive key on this side is held on over here with some adhesive. There's a rubber gasket and mesh filter over the speaker opening on the frame, And now that the battery has been removed, we can clearly see the flex cable for the screen, which is routed through an opening in the mid frame. So if you needed to replace your screen, you'd have to remove the back plate, and then you'd have to remove the screws and the top plastic cover, as well as the cover that's covering the connectors and the speaker assembly. Then you would disconnect the battery cables and the flex cables on top, including the screen cable. You would pry off the battery and disconnect the flex cable for the fingerprint reader, which is connected to the subboard. You'd then heat up the front of the phone where the screen is to loosen up the adhesive underneath. You'd pry your old screen off, apply new adhesive, reapply your new screen, making sure you run the flex cable through the opening in mid frame, as well as the flex cable for the fingerprint reader, and then you'd reassemble the phone. Now let's go ahead and disconnect the headphone jack cable and remove that. Here's a better look at the headphone jack. There's a protective film covering the connector of the front-facing camera that needs to be peeled off so we can disconnect and remove it. Here's a better look at the 16 megapixel front-facing camera. There's a standoff screw which is holding on the main board that needs to be removed. Now the main board can be lifted up and removed. On the main board, there's a 64 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide, and the 2 megapixel macro lens. None of the cameras have OIS or optical image stabilization. The camera connectors can be disconnected by just popping them off. There's a secondary microphone located on top underneath the shield, and a liquid damage indicator sticker, which is a white sticker over here. There's also copper tape on these shields. Once the copper tape is peeled back, there's thermal pads covering the chips underneath. Here's a better look with the thermal pads removed. Taking a look at the back of the main board, the proximity sensor is located here, and there's more copper tape on the back shields as well as thermal paste. Once the copper tape is peeled back, there's some thermal paste on top of the RAM and processor, as well as a thermal pad which is seated on top of the ROM, or storage. Here's a better look at the LPDDR5 RAM, which is seated on top of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor. Now that both the motherboard and battery are removed, we can see the large copper vapor chamber which sits underneath the battery as well as the motherboard, and that helps transfer heat away from the components and out through the screen. The 20,000 RPM fan is located here, and the flex cable for it is located underneath. The flex cable for the other touch capacitive key is located here, and there are plastic covers on the frame which would need to be lifted up and removed if you wanted to remove the flex cables and replace them. There are 2 Phillips screws and an aluminum cover covering the flex cable for the gaming key. The earpiece speaker is located on top and is held down with adhesive, and the flex cable runs along the side. And there's a second X-axis vibrator motor on the top right, and that's also held down with some adhesive. The flex cable for the power button and volume keys is on the side, and there's a metal bracket inside the slot in the frame which is holding them in, so if you need to replace that, you'd have to lift up and pull out the metal bracket. There are 2 more T4 or Torx 4 screws which are holding on this cover on the side that's covering an antenna board. Once those screws are removed, we can lift up this cover and remove it, and then we can see the antenna board. This black coaxial cable connects this antenna board to the main board, as well as this flex cable which is connected to the flex cable for the power button and volume keys. There's also a third microphone on this antenna board. For the repairability score, I give this phone a 3 out of 10. Now it's time to put this phone back together. Once everything's back in place, apply new adhesive and reapply your back plate. Flip over the phone, power it on, and you're done. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.